So a slice of life then. We've had some good stuff happening here at St. Luke's this week, my friends. And that's because I think many of you have spent this past, I always wanted to go there, spent this past week packing, right, the backpacks. Folks have come from all around, not just packing these backpacks for the children here in Bartlesville, but of course, for those within the county, Washington County. And if you've been here, right, you know, right, this sanctuary every pew was filled, stacked high with backpacks. Rogers Hall, and in some places different in the church, there's mountains, right, of paper, just boxes of pencils and crayons. Folders with brads and without brads. I didn't even know that there were what brads were. And then there were these little tags, these little white tags that stood in for the children that were going to receive the bags. These little tags for kids that we may never meet. So, you know, with all of those backpacks being in here, the weekly round of prayer that happens Monday through Friday now, because Penny's praying morning prayer in here on Friday, you know, the backpacks were in this space while the prayers of the church were going on. And folks as young as, I think, 5. I mean, the kid that I saw could be no older than 5, with a backpack that was like the size of their torso, right? Was following along someone who is as old as 78, right? Walking through, packing these bags with care. And in doing so, when I watched all of this happen at St. Luke's, I thought that these people who had come here to do that, well, they were telling a story with their actions. It was, I think, love in action. And I hold that in one hand, and we turn to Hosea in the other one. Right? In today's reading from Hosea, God looks at Israel like a parent who just can't help themselves. Looking at Israel, God says, when Israel was a child, I loved him. In fact, I took him up in my arms. I led him with cords of kindness, drawn to me with bands of love. This is God reflecting on Israel. And talks about that he, you know, with kind of tenderness, brings Israel close to his cheek in an embrace. This has to be, I think, one of the tenderest passages in Scripture. And the Hebrew word, I'm not trying to be a biblical language scholar. I don't know, like, the whole Hebrew lexicon, right? But there's a few words that I do know because they have meaning. This word behind that tender, faithful love of God, it's not grace, but it's Hesed is how it's pronounced. Hesed. It's not a fleeting or a passing affection, but it's a deep covenantal love, a love that shows up, a love that does something, a love that holds on, even maybe especially when it's hard, when it's difficult. And yet we know the story, right? We know that the story of Israel is not all tenderness, right? It's not love all the time, right? We know that Israel, in fact, it mentions it right in that second verse, that Israel turns away from God. Israel chases after other gods. It worships Baal, right? But instead of God cutting himself off from them, instead of instead of God saying, you know what, enough. God remembers his love for them. Matter of fact, he says, how can I give you up? Even after all of that, he says, how can I give you up? Matter of fact, my heart, it recoils within me to do such a thing. And because of that, my compassion grows warm and tender. Like our response would be to maybe avert our gaze, but in the face of betrayal, right? God says, how can I turn away? That's Hesed. That's not just a love that's spoken, but a love that's lived out faithfully in the face of hardship, in the face of hurt. And you know what is more, God does this again and again, right? God continually comes to his people. God continually inclines his ear towards them, drawing them close, protecting them, providing for them, calling them back, right? He does this again and again. He calls them home. And what is more, he calls them back to himself and to themselves. They are to be a holy people, and they are to remember this. In Luke's gospel, we hear a very different story, right? Right? We hear of this man, this parable about a man who stores up for himself more and more. He's done well. His crops have produced abundantly. He's got a good harvest. He's got full barns. And what does he do? He builds bigger barns, right? And an image I think that some of us miss, right? Because we're so captivated by, I think, the things and the abundance of wheat and the material possessions, right? That we forget, or maybe we look past the sense that this man talks to himself, right? Very end of it, he says, soul? And then he answers himself, yes. It's a little weird, you know? But then again, it's us too. And I think the story is not saying that storing up grain is wrong or having an abundant harvest is wrong. It's that his love stops with his own reflection. He says to his own soul, I've got all this. Let's relax, right, Dan? Let's eat, drink, and be merry. And God says, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And those things that you've saved up for yourselves, whose will they be? Perhaps, in other words, you can't take it with you, I guess. And I think the parable is jarring because it kind of holds up a mirror to those who are consumed, I think, and at times with themselves. If we're honest, most of us know how to compartmentalize. I think in a lot of ways, sometimes just to get through life, we have to compartmentalize, right? This world can be very overwhelming at times. But you know, the danger with compartmentalization is that over time we can find ourselves living in a way where we do not factor in that our actions have consequences, and that each of our actions is in relationship to the world around us. And over time, that self-awareness can make, I guess, love something we say a lot about, but rarely ever do selflessly. And I think that's why weeks like the one that we just had here at St. Luke's matter so much, because it puts things back into perspective. When people packed those backpacks for these kids, they didn't just say, we care about the kids here in Bartlesville. They showed it. When folks donated boxes of crayons this year, when people took the time to acknowledge volunteers who worked out in the heat, when you heeded the call, right, as a community to host this, you were living a love that was not just upon your lips, but it was in your life as you gave up something. You gave up this space. You leveraged your currency of space so that others might have. And that's a kind of love that steps into the gap, you see. It fills not just the backpack, but it stocks the pantry at concern, right? This kind of love overflows, right? It sits beside someone who's lonely at Green Country. It feeds the hungry at Agape. It gives witness to your friends who work in ministries outside these walls, who minister to persecuted Christians worldwide, right? It gives witness to people who are active in ministry beyond the borders of St. Luke's and this country. That type of love travels. And I think if you think about it, if you look back over your own life, I'd be willing to guess, right, that you'll see that God's faithfulness, God's Hesed love, has shown up for you not just in words, but in deeds as well. Perhaps it's when someone cooked you a meal, and someone brought that meal to your house when you were grieving, took you to the hospital, sat with you there, visited with you, when someone prayed for you when you couldn't pray for yourself. And I think that's how God's love gets traction in this world, through God's people who live it out, even and especially when loving that way is hard. This week the church on Wednesday will remember the Feast of the Transfiguration. We usually get that reading sort of like right before Lent. This is the actual feast day this week. The moment when Jesus ascends the mountain, right, and he's transfigured, his clothes turn dazzling white, and a voice from heaven returns, right, comes back, and it says, "Hey, this is my kid. This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." But here's the thing. Before we get all ready to celebrate that, it will be mindful for us to remember that God, the same God who is transfigured, transfigured on the mountaintop, tells us how to live here on the ground. He warns us not to build bigger barns for ourselves, but in fact to make room for others. He shows us that God's love is not just something that we believe, but it's something that we must continue to embody. And that's the invitation for us here as Luke's people, as Christ's own, to let that Hesed of God, that fierce, faithful love we see in Hosea, shape how we live every single day. Because in some sense, at some times. Love that's just spoken. Sometimes it's just a lot of hot air. Love that's only believed in sometimes is just an idea. But a love that's done, love that's handed out in backpacks, served in empty bowls, spoken in phone calls, written in cards, shared in hospital visits, is made visible and traveling to other countries to make sure that people are taken care of. That's the kind of love that's not bent on building bigger barns, but is a love that desires a crowded table. And your picture on the wall.